There we go.
I guess that's the attention.
That's supposed to be the attention getter. Yeah, we're running a little late here. We're just we're trickling in at a lesser pace than other times. So, well, thank you for being here. As we continue on, last week we were exploring how the changes that were kind of happening and taking place and what was going on in those 1830s, 40s, and so on, and there's this if you will, orthodoxy is forming, and of course orthodoxy is supposedly what the truth is, the understandings, that set of beliefs that are believed to be true, if you will, and so we had great discussion last week. John R. Howard and I searched high and low trying to find a picture of him. Of course, remember, photographs were new back then, and so it's interesting as I try to put up photographs. A lot of times, it's like these guys or whoever are quite aged, and that's for a number of reasons. Probably they didn't have enough money to get a photograph, frankly, and the newer technology, so on and so forth. So these early times, it's harder to find those visuals, and I really tried to find some of John R. Howard, but I could not find any. And so John R. Howard, 1807, 1870, so, contemporary of Campbell, a little bit younger, didn't live a whole lot longer, but he was an influential preacher and an editor in Tennessee in the 1830s and the 1840s, who launched the Bible Advocate. So that was his journal. And perhaps the first paper published in the state of Tennessee for the avowed purpose of advocating a return to primitive Christianity. In other words, advocating the position of the Restoration movement, certainly as he understood it. More important, Howard was influential as anyone in the movement's early years through his articles and sermons toward defining what we would call the Church of Christ in America as the true church, and toward denominationalizing the concept of non-denominational Christianity. And so you go, huh? What does that mean? Well, as we've talked a little bit about it, the idea that a denomination is people together with a certain set of beliefs and understandings and kind of agreements, if you will, on doctrine, or however you want to say it, is one aspect of it. We also look at it in terms of how we've often looked at it as this structure of authority from above dictating to those down below. And so in our heritage, we had a strong independent or focus on that independence of the congregation rather than a hierarchical structure. Bill.
Restoration movement used to mean, this was decades ago.
Okay.
Somebody decided one point in time, 1807 or whenever, I want to restore this church to what it was in X period of time.
Yeah.
And then it's like I gave the impression, or had the impression, that it all started out because somebody stood up one day and said, we should have a restoration movement. The name Restoration Movement applied to somebody, whether it's one person or a group of people, who sat down one day and decided, I'm going to study the Bible and look at it through the eyes of my early Christian brothers and sisters and understand the Word of God. And that's what started the Restoration Movement. That's just a thought I had for you.
Well, I think there's...
take that terminology and make it the title of the subject. And it actually started before that.
Well, sure, and I think hopefully we saw when we were looking and discovering our roots that there's been many over centuries that have had that impulse of a desire, and it wasn't unique and didn't start in the 19th century, if you will, with our fellowship. But that's really true. And so, often we see too that we hopefully saw in discovering our roots is a lot of times there is a particular emphasis that particular group is wanting to restore or puts up in great importance. And that may not be the same emphasis as what this group over here is wanting to restore. And so, there's always these differences. But remember, in the 19th century America, there was this strong desire to define and clarify as to what's the true church, because there was so many understandings that were out there. Now, why was that? Because this was America. And if you're over back in the old country, the state controlled things, whether it be in this country or that country or whatever, and that was rigidly applied or enforced. And so that freedom to have so many different perceptions was also, just part of what was going on. However, there was, frustration about that. But anyhow, back to the last statement that how can you denominationalize non-denominational? Well, if you make that the whole point and the emphasis, you're just that's just doing the same thing on insisting. And so that's kind of interesting as we look at that. But anyhow, Howard, like many of his day, was troubled, as we said, by the question associated with religious pluralism in America. In the midst of denominational diversity, where is the true church? How now to be found? And how shall we be enabled to know it, to identify it, to recognize it? And those are valid questions today. Yeah. In other words, the question is seeking truth. And in formulating his answer, Howard looked to a common practice of his day. He's finding an analogy with something we're going to discuss here in a second of how they did things, and that was defining your land. And Howard noted how early pioneers in the Western country, now remember what the West is. Now it's not west of the Mississippi. We're still east of the Mississippi. Established their claims to land by carving marks on the trees at the corners of the claim, and so each one facing one of the other corners in the tract. Now, it's really interesting, when I was reading years ago one of the biographies on Daniel Boone, and him going from North Carolina into Kentucky. George Washington was a surveyor, also with him, and they went out to these unclaimed areas, meaning the white American civilization didn't own them, and they would go out and survey these lands and then stake their claim. And so they had to, how did you mark these things out? Well, they would carve into the trees. And in some places, there's still evidence of this in some places as far as how they did that. And so what he did was he took this process or this way of identifying it, and he was going to equate that to what was going on with Campbell and the Restoration Movement. And it goes as such. Howard told of an old Revolutionary soldier in Virginia who had claimed land in the West and returned home. And remember, this practice wasn't odd. So for service, a lot of times in the Army, they'd say, you go out here and stake your claim. And so they would get free land and things like that. And so this was not unknown to what was going on. And who had claimed land in the West and then returned home and then returned later to settle the claim, only to find it overgrown and other people had settled on it. Again, not uncommon. They would go and find this, and they would go back to when they had some more means often, or et cetera, and then they could go back to their land. And so in this process, in the story, what he had staked out was overgrown, and others had moved in because they didn't know. The organized system of establishing who had claims and who didn't was not well developed, if you will, and so others coming in and doing that would not be surprising. And so he was unable to find his original corner. So he had to find that first corner, because then that would point him to the other directions, and was in despair till he found someone who remembered where his original marked corner was located. From this beginning corner, he was able to find the other markers he had made many years before, and the soldiers' attempts to take possession of the land were challenged, but eventually he was supported in court. Okay, so here is this story, and probably happened. Maybe not that specific, but events like that. And so Howard applied this story then to Alexander Campbell. So he's making this analogy for the people that he's writing to and speaking to, and his importance to the current movement. He told the narrative this way: the old soldier's beginning corner was the old Jerusalem gospel. In other words, that New Testament Christianity. He said later, settlers, Catholics, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, and the like, had staked out claims as the vines and underbrush of human tradition had covered over the old Jerusalem trunk. In other words, the claims and the understandings of the corruption that had taken place over the many centuries in Christianity from that which was first established, as the understanding goes. But Alexander Campbell, and so now it's saying this is how it is meaning to us now, exposed and tore away the human additions and appendages, the traditions, the mysticism, and the error with which the marks on the Jerusalem trunk, the corner of primitive Christianity, had been covered over, obscured, and hidden from the view of men, and identified it by the original marks to be the same one made by Peter. And this is the reason why Alexander Campbell is so much opposed and abused by the various religious parties who have made their new corners and run out their own tracks on the old survey. And so for him, he's using this story, and to him it's completely analogous to what's going on. And so again, this understanding that what Campbell did through the Christian Baptists and the preaching and what was going on in the Restoration movement was exposing all these problems that they saw and deviations from what was in the New Testament, as certainly as he understood it, and then they did. And then when they did that, lo and behold, they found exactly what Peter had done. Funny how that works. And so this jumping of history from back then to look what God's doing now, using this man to bring that about, is kind of his, in his mind, what's going on and what is significant, and in many minds. You know, those who are following made lots and lots of sense. Now, Howard was very famous for this sermon that he had wrote and that he published and was later published and published again, and that was dealing with how can we tell what the marks of the true church are. Now, I know many of us probably heard sermons like that, you know, at some time in our lives, and pointing out all the things that we do that we think is right and why the others aren't. But anyhow, so Howard's trying to establish some of what he sees as those true marks. And again, it isn't just him. He's really kind of reflecting what was going on rather than necessarily originating this. First of all, the Church of Christ originated in the days of the apostles and was founded by them. Okay, I mean, we're not unfamiliar with some of these. Makes sense. The Church of Christ is known and recognized in the New Testament by such appellations as Church of God and Church of Christ. Hence, we may with propriety call it the Christian Church or Church of Christ. So here we see this idea of a name being established, and then that would eventually evolve to where it was preached that if you don't have Church of Christ out there, you're not a real church. And this argument isn't as strong as maybe it once thought it was, if you will. But anyhow, so this idea of what a name is. Now the church now, which has no creed but the Bible, is, all things else being equal, the true Church of Christ. In other words, okay, what he's saying is this. He's saying we claim to only use the Bible. You're using your Westminster Confession of Faith and having to give allegiance to that understanding, or this or that, or whatever these established, you know, we've all heard of the different Nicene creeds and all this. And so in this time, many looked at the establishment of that orthodoxy as that wasn't right. Now, it isn't necessarily everything said in it was wrong, but the idea of that, and say, let's use just this. Now, that sounds good, and it's certainly noble. But in reality, that's not as pure as we think it is. Because, as we've mentioned before, everybody has influences, whether they're formal or informal. How many of us heard what the preacher said? Well, that's influencing us. Wow, I hadn't thought of that. Wow. And that's okay. It's just that, there's influences in understandings. As we read about the cultures of the past and those things, the way we might understand it might not necessarily be the way they understood it. And so if we're going to get a proper understanding, we have to look deeply, and that's history, that's context, and we're not unfamiliar with these things as we strive to do that. But anyhow, so in this environment of where they're dealing with all these long established things, it's let's get back to the Bible, and if you're not using just the Bible, you're not the true church, is what he's saying. Now, the Church of Christ is Catholic, and the word Catholic means universal. And the Church of Christ is the only true Catholic or universal church. All others are sectarian parties. In other words, it applies to everybody but us, is his understanding. A fifth mark of the true church is its terms of admission. There are faith, repentance, confession, and baptism in the order here presented and in their biblical import and application. And we already previously discussed that aspect of that. And so again, how you become a Christian is basically how you might say it, and this understanding. And again, I think we're familiar with this and understand this because this is deeply embedded in us. Another mark of the true Church of Christ is its organization. Piety is a term that is used often in circles today. And congregational independence with certain officers, including bishops or elders, deacons and deaconesses. What's he doing? And evangelists. Okay, and so we're talking about the organization, that if you have your, whatever over you, et cetera, it isn't right. And so this idea of independence, and that's deeply established in our DNA, that understanding. The idea of elders, plurality of elders, so on and so forth. And so that's really significant. And so he's saying, this is what we've become convinced of, therefore it must be right. Therefore, anybody does anything different, that's not the true church. And so, and the congregations thus organized met together every Lord's Day to partake of the Lord's Supper and to attend public worship of God. The government of these congregations was strictly that of New Testament form, meaning elders and so on and so forth. And the church now having this worship and this government is, all things else being equal or having all the other marks, the true church. And so here's Howard establishing these significant points to his understandings. Now, this is the 1840s. Okay, this is the 1840s. And so it's happened early, these understandings. It's interesting to find a document so early revealing a hardening of orthodoxy, this firming up of this understanding. If we remember when we talked about Barton Stone previously, remember they were very open to people understanding, reading, and there was not this hard orthodoxy in what Stone was doing. And so we see this changing. Now, part of this comes about by, we've heard it said many, the Baconian way of looking at things, that scientific way of, common sense realism and all that we've looked at. That's working here to come to certain conclusions and understandings. Whereas if you're not looking at it that way, that doesn't necessarily demand those conclusions and understandings. And so this is the why. Not saying right, wrong, just saying this is the why. It's interesting, again, that this hardening is in the midst of all the religious pluralism going on in the country. So we see this defining amidst all this independence that's going on in the country, including the persistent use of the Church of Christ. Now, I think we've mentioned this. Campbell preferred the name disciples. Stone, Church of Christ. But what we're going to start, and that was interchangeable for quite a while. But we're going to see in these writings and different things, for some, there's this focusing and firming up on that. I mean, I remember our preacher, when I was in college, someone said, do you have to have Christ in the name of your church? And of course he said yes, and gave the explanation and all that. And it's not that that's an incorrect way of understanding or incorrect to have that. But then back to that original argument, well, what if someone called themselves the Church of the Firstborn? That's just as biblical as, or Church of God. Paul uses that. And so when there was this fixation on a name, and if you don't have the name right, that's just ignoring the other things. And again, we can do that when we get excited and really into something. We can focus on certain things. So Howard did not so much define orthodoxy, but rather reflected what was already happening around him. He was just kind of part of that. It is further remarkable how much the ideas presented in 1848 still characterize churches of Christ in the later 20th century, and even to lesser degree in the 21st century. In other words, this understanding has been changing over the decades, meaning the strictness or the hardness of it. Except the inclusion of the office of deaconess. And so, what are you doing, Howard? Deaconess. And so, we know that that's caused much consternation and so on and so forth over time. But that's a study for another time, looking at that, if you will. Because, wait, this guy's hardcore, sectarian, if you will, in these understandings, and yet he says that. Didn't he get the memo? And so I just find that interesting.
But if you define the word deacon or deaconess, then we recognize that there are deaconesses in this church.
There very much are. But at one time, you couldn't say that. And in other places, you couldn't say that.
You didn't give a, I said,
Okay.
if you defined it as the term that it means. The term deacon means servant.
Yes.
We're all servants. Or we should be anyway.
Very much so.
So,
Very
we
much
are
so.
all either deacons or deaconesses. We've made it an office that, with an hierarchy or whatever.
Yeah.
The elders are here.
And it was
the deacons are here,
and
the rest of us are down.
and the office is for guys and not for gals. Right?
Yes.
Right, but that's another discussion, or I should say many
I'm
discussions.
just saying, if they had used the term servant,
Yeah.
I don't think there would be that much of a.
Well, but supposedly in the scripture there is this, male female designation as to why there's a translating of it that way. I mean, I don't do Greek.
Yeah, they're taking Timothy and Titus and locking in on that, and completely forgetting that Paul calls a specific lady a deaconess.
Yeah.
It's tunnel vision of the people writing at the time. It's those of us buying in.
Well, but it's also can be to the understanding that we came to in this time, looking back, and there's all kinds of explanations people have tried to come up with, and gymnastics, if you will, trying to explain that away, trying to this and that, trying to say it's, but it's there, And so how should that information maybe modify understandings that, may have been in more current times? Just interesting. Bill?
And it had been mentioned much earlier in your class, I know, that all of this restoration movement actually started in the mid-first century.
Good point. Good point.
How are we to operate? How are we to treat the Gentiles? Should we include some of this Jewish stuff in this Christian stuff? And all of these started cooking back then on trying to straighten it out.
Trying to straighten it out. And some may question whether it ever has been straightened out.
Yeah.
Some think they have.
And maybe the problem is not the problem, maybe the problem is the people trying to straighten it out.
That's a good point. I think I've mentioned this before, where someone I was reading where a student didn't like things Paul was saying on some stuff. And then the professor said, maybe the problem isn't Paul, it's maybe our interpretation of Paul. And I think that's a really profound statement, because we assume that because it's clear to us, and this is so obvious, that must be it, and it should be for everybody else. And that's not the case. Now, it's easy to get that if we stay in our own little bubble. If we only talk to people that all think alike, or read the trusted authors, as some have said that, or so on and so forth, and you realize there's a lot of different perspectives out there, and there's points to be made, and so just interesting. Though Walter Scott, and Howard, or through them, we see how an orthodox theology that would characterize our fellowship developed. These were not the only influencers on thinking, but they were representative of many. It is important to note that while these points are recognized as characteristic, there's always a wide spectrum, and there's always variations. So even though there's some general understandings there, because you notice Howard didn't talk about one cup. That hadn't, however. Or, did you have a kitchen? Or I was just talking to Betty, and maybe some of you know this answer, I don't know. Is the understanding of mutual edification, where the members all preach, is that connected to no located preachers? Or is that two different things? I'm not sure.
If you didn't have a located preacher, there'd be times when one of us would have to be at the place of Shane because he was.
Sure.
So you have mutual edification by definition if you have a non-located preacher.
But there's some that took, and obviously you didn't have trained preachers, you didn't have, it was a group the way it was out of necessity, it was certainly that. And then as things developed, maybe there became more as could afford or so on. But then there did develop among some the understanding that the scriptures show there's no located preachers. And so they say, if you have one, you're not right. And again, there's probably some connection, but I don't know if that means exactly the same thing, but that's a side point. There were also those who viewed themselves as the guardians of the faith and would expose anyone who presented ideas that deviated from the truth. There were journals that wrote up those who would dare to think otherwise. There was no middle ground. Others insisted on the Baconian hermeneutic was the only way to understand Scripture, and it was held as sacred. Our theology continued to evolve, and there were others who contributed additional dimensions on what would be defined as orthodoxy as we consider then the second generation, if you will, of leaders. Mentioning one of those journals, and I didn't really we're not really covering that just because there's been so much, but there was a guy that had the heretic detector. And this was in the 19th century. His name was I'm not sure what his name was, Critchfield or Crittenton or something like that. And yeah. And so his whole sole purpose was to examine you and find out and to check you out to find out if what you're saying or doing goes along with what it should be. And of course, remember, we're supposed to all think independently, read the Bible for ourselves, but if you don't toe the line, wow, I thought that's what a denomination was, if you will. And so anyhow, just kind of interesting. And again, we've talked about this hermeneutic and what did that become? Cena. Remember what Cena is? Command, example, necessary inference. That's a little, what's that, an acronym? Is that what, Cena? Thank you. Those English terms throw me off. And so that became the only way, the orthodox way of interpreting Scripture. And of course, what happened as we look historically in us, some people took that necessary inference part and almost elevated it to the higher end. And so many of those arguments over so many things and divisions was over that. And again, how did that come about? Well, trying to define and understand as they're seeking to look into the Scriptures to see what they did and how they did it, restoring. Okay, so I'm not that there was a good purpose or desire or intentions behind that, but what ended up happening. So that leads us then into our second generation. So after Campbell, Howard knows, and remember with generations, it's not this and this, it's this. It's that overlap. It's that transitioning time. In 1843, John Howard noted with considerable unhappiness the announcement that a new periodical called the Christian Review would begin serving the Stone Campbell movement in the South in direct composition to his own Bible Advocate. In 7 years, the Bible Advocate ceased publication, and the editor of the new publication would become the most powerful and influential person in Churches of Christ in the South during the middle years of the 19th century. Do you know who that is? No. He's later. Tolbert Fanning. And you go, who's Tolbert Fanning? Never heard of that guy. Oh, we're going to. We're going to look in some detail. He actually taught Lipscomb. He was kind of Lipscomb's mentor and all that. And so Tolbert Fanning was the editor of the Christian Review, which was first published in 1844. It was the first of 4 successive highly influential publications that Fanning circulated among Churches of Christ in the South. The others included the Christian Magazine from 1848 to 1853, and then the Gospel Advocate, which we're all familiar with, which started in 1855, and the Religious Historian, which was obviously a little later, 1872 to 1874. In addition, Fanning founded Franklin College near Nashville in Franklin, Tennessee, and the first college associated with Churches of Christ in the South, and served as president of the institution from 1845 until the eve of the Civil War. Okay, so he was all about education. Also, Fanning grew up in Alabama, and he was influenced by preachers that were influenced by Stone. And so he was greatly in there. But he was a very, very, very significant figure. Born in 1810, Fanning grew up in northern Alabama under the tutelage of preachers, we said, influenced by Stone. Fanning absorbed many of Stone's perspectives. At the same time, in his teens, Fanning came under influence of people devoted to Campbell's idea. Remember, these were 2 separate organic happenings that were going on in the country. Remember, there's this spirit. It's a time. And he's gaining traction. This understanding. By the 1830s, Fanning became a devoted disciple of Campbell after two developments. In the late 1820s, early 30s, Fanning met Campbell and was enormously impressed by him. And Campbell was a very impressive guy. You know, his education level, et cetera, et cetera. You know, he was one of the richest guys in America from his farming that he did in West Virginia. Yeah, it was, now remember, this is early on. But yeah, he was really well-to-do later on. He was very much into all that and learning the different things. And you know, when they sit around the kitchen table, and their kitchen table was about as long as that pew in the back, and they'd often have a lot of people in that they discussed all these things, not just religion, but all these advances and all this kind of stuff, and very, very fascinating stuff. And so the second development was in 1832. Fanning enrolled in the University of Nashville, and there he studied under Philip Lindsay, who was a strong proponent of the Baconian common sense rationalism, this way of looking at things, of understanding the world and how you understood it. And his studies reinforce his devotion to the principles of Campbell. Because remember, that's where Scott was coming from, that's where Campbell's coming from, that's where the Christian Baptist is coming from, all from that way of looking at things. So Fanning's relationship with Campbell really blossomed when Campbell invited Fanning to accompany him on a preaching tours in 1835 and 1836. So they're spending a lot of time together. On this trip, Fanning preached many sermons. In these sermons, Fanning demonstrated little interest in Campbell's theme of unity and instead revealed his frustration with the religious pluralism in the United States. Because so many people believe that if you are not pleased with one religion, select another. In other words, he's saying that's kind of the mindset that's going on. Similar to our time might be when people would see on the trucks, attend a church of your choice. Okay, that kind of brought about similar reactions, if you will. And Fanning suggested that the 19th century might well be regarded as the most remarkable era for adorations from the truth in the annals of time. In other words, Fanning's looking at this, and he's studying the scriptures and saying, this is so clear. And he says, you know, the 19th century might be the time when people just went all different directions, more than maybe any other time in history. And maybe he's right. We might question that today. We might say, you got nothing on us. But nonetheless. And so Fanning sought to demonstrate to hearers in a sermon in Boston that the true church of the apostolic age had been restored on the earth and now thrived in the American Southwest. Now remember, Tennessee is the American Southwest. Okay, just for context. I'm talking Arizona and New Mexico. Do my sectarian friends ask me for an example now in the world of apostolic order? In the United States, there were over 100,000, mostly in the Western country, who have taken the Bible untrammeled by human philosophy and scholastic extravagances and made a bold and solemn march for primitive ground and practices. In other words, their ideas are spreading, and they're spreading fast. It was this concern about religious pluralism that prompted Fanning to launch the Christian Review in 1844. That was his first paper. He was distressed that among the various sects, the Church of Christ was woefully misrepresented and perverted throughout the length and breadth of the land. Publications in opposition to our teachings are constantly being used or being issued from the secretaries around us, and something else or something for self-defense is absolutely required. So his view is he started this to put out there the ideas of what the restoration movement was about and to combat all the other journals that were out there and competing with those ideas. And with that, we will stop. Bernie's standing up, so that means it's time. So thank you very much, and we will continue next week.
You wonder what would happen if they had the internet.
Oh my gosh. Podcast. Well, but remember, that was the podcast of the day. That was the way of disseminating information. Obviously, much slower. And so you're commenting on an article. The next issue, I'm publishing the letter you sent me. That probably took weeks to get to me. And so that's how this back and forth is going on in addition to public debates. But yes, very different, much slower, but not